Again, as always, thank you all for coming here today. And again, as always, if you could please silence the cell phones or put them on vibrate, just so we can avoid any interruptions. My name is Muhammad. I'm the director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. And on behalf of our staff and our board of directors, we welcome you here. And it's a pleasure to welcome everybody also that's watching online. It's also a great honor to introduce and welcome back our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Michael Fischbach, who will be speaking about his latest book called Black Power and Palestine, Transnational Countries of Color. And again, Dr. Fischbach has been here. It's been a while, but he has been here before, and he's a good friend of ours. So thank you, Dr. Fischbach. The 1967 Arab-Israeli War rocketed the question of Israel and Palestine onto the front pages of American newspapers. Black Power activists saw Palestinians as a kindred people of color, waging the same struggle for freedom and justice as themselves. Soon, concerns over the Arab-Israeli conflict spread across mainstream black politics and into the heart of the civil rights movement itself. Black Power and Palestine uncovers why so many African Americans, notably Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Muhammad Ali, among others, who came to support the Palestinians or felt the need to respond to those who did. In chronicling this story, Dr. Fischbach reveals much about how American peoples of color create political strategies, a sense of self, and a place within U.S. and global communities. The shadow cast by events of the 1960s and 1970s continues to affect the United States in deep structural ways. This is the first book to explore how conflict in the Middle East shaped the American civil rights movement. Again, after the event, copies of the book will be available for purchase, so please buy one on your way out, and I'm sure Dr. Fischbach would sign it for you. Just a little bit about Dr. Fischbach. He's a professor of history at Randolph-Macon College and the author of numerous publications and books, including Jewish Property Claims Against Arab Countries, which is published by the Columbia University Press, The Peace Process and Palestinian Refugee Claims, Addressing Claims for Property Compensation and Restitution, published by the U.S. Institute of Peace Press, and Records of Dispossession, Palestinian Refugee Property and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, published by Columbia University Press and the American University of Cairo Press. He was awarded grants by the MacArthur Foundation and the U.S. Institute of Peace, and has presented at numerous academic and diplomatic settings in 16 countries on 4 continents. Dr. Fischbach will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session. For the Q&A session, please wait for the mic to come to you so that everybody online can hear. And I'll remind you all again, please also keep the questions brief, to the point, and actually a question. And for our online audience, you can tweet your questions to us at Palestine Center. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Michael Fischbach.
Thank you, Muhammad, for that kind introduction. I didn't quite recognize myself in all the things you were saying, but it's always nice to be back here at the Palestine Center and in Washington in general. After a period of activism in Chicago, I basically cut my teeth on the Middle East here in Washington at Georgetown University, where I studied for both my master and my doctorate, and some work with the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. So it's always nice to drive up the 90 miles from Central Virginia and be back here in Washington. It's also always a privilege for me to speak here at this particular center because one of my doctoral dissertation advisors, well, first of all, one of them is Dr. Judith Tucker, who's sitting right here, the sole remaining member of my committee who is alive. because I want to mention one of the others who was, I should say, Dr. Hisham Sharabi. And of course, Dr. Sharabi played such an important role in the establishment of the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center. I'm always reminded when I come back to DC of the days when I was a student assistant of his. In fact, before I get into my topic, let me tell you a cute little story about Dr. Sharabi. When I first came to Washington in 1984, I was literally working as a bartender at his house, he and his wife Gail, and they had all these esteemed people, you know, Michael Hudson and all these folks that we were reading about in our courses, and I was so impressed. And Dr. Sharabi, who was very stone-faced, even when he was telling a joke, said, in the middle of the party, he said, "Have any of you ever seen the video about how Michael Jackson made the Thriller video?" Not the Thriller video itself, the film of how he made it. And I was just stunned. I was like, Hisham Sharabi, Michael Jackson, what? And the entire party went downstairs to some basement to watch this film, and I was left washing dishes, thinking, oh my God, these people have real sides to them. They're real humans after all. And Dr. Sharabi, I have many other great stories about him. So when I'm always back at the Palestine Center, I'm reminded of him. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Mohammed as well as Samir Al-Qasim for arranging me to come here. Let me begin my talk today with a story. Historians love stories. Several months after the June 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the left-wing writer Paul Jacobs invited a friend of his, an Israeli diplomat named Ephraim Evron, to meet with some Black Power militants in the Watts section of Los Angeles, the scene of a very destructive Black urban rebellion in August 1965. Evron was a minister at the Israeli embassy in Washington, who earlier had asked Jacobs why young Black nationalists had supported the Arabs instead of Israel during the recent war. So Jacobs used his connection to find a group of about 20 young Blacks that were willing to talk to the Israeli diplomat. Evron and Jacobs eventually met up with them at a vocational school on Central Avenue in Watts in early 1968. The Israeli received quite an earful. The men told him approvingly that the Arabs had supported peoples of color around the world, but most of their comments were directed as complaints about the Jewish community of Los Angeles. First, they opined that the money raised by Los Angeles Jews to plant trees in Israel came from profits they claimed were skimmed from the city's Black consumers, and that therefore it should be their names inscribed on the trees. They groused. Another man lashed out by noting that when the Jewish community staged the Rally for Israel's Survival at the Hollywood Bowl in June 1967, they had invited none other than the arch-conservative California Governor Ronald Reagan to speak. The Israeli diplomat endured another nationalist rant that the funds raised by the local Jewish community to help pay for Israeli arms purchases were funds taken from the Black community. And when the flustered Israeli diplomat asked why he, and therefore Israel, should be blamed for the action of Southern California Jews, one militant replied with a classic Zionist argument, "You're all one people, aren't you?" The story of the Israeli diplomat's encounter with the Black Power militants in Watts is instructive, inasmuch as it sheds light on the fact that African Americans were very keen observers of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the 60s and 70s, and interpreted it in ways that related to their own lives and priorities at home. Much has been written about the Black freedom struggle, yet Black Americans' connection to the Middle East and the ways it affected them and their conceptualization of identity and agency mostly have been overlooked. Who today remembers that famous Black activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Jesse Jackson visited parts of Arab Palestine and issued public pronouncements on the conflict? Militants from the Black Panther Party, ministers from various Christian denominations, Black congressional representatives, even the boxer Muhammad Ali, all visited the Arab world as well during that tumultuous period of time and met with Palestinians from all walks of life, including PLO chair Yasser Arafat. Important Black political conferences issued statements on Israel and the Palestinians, and Black men and women of letters, like those in the Black arts movement, highlighted Middle East issues in their poetry and prose. Now, given the high high-profile nature of the conflict after the June '67 war put it so squarely in the world's newspapers, it should come as no surprise that both militant blacks and more conservative civil rights leaders both found themselves drawn into taking stands on that distant conflict. And it was not simply because this conflict was so much in the headlines, but also because it had tremendous resonance with regard to African Americans' respective agendas and understandings of how black identity and black political activity should be expressed in America. Indeed, the truth is that black arguments over whether to support Israel or the Palestinians mirrored much deeper intra-black debates about race, identity, and political action in the 60s and 70s. And those discussions ended up symbiotically affecting both them and the people of the faraway Middle East. Because how to approach the Arab-Israeli conflict became then much more than just a tertiary sideshow to more important matters that were facing Americans of African descent at that time. With the result, as I said, that black advocacy for one side or the other in the conflict ended up deeply affecting not just them, but the wider American society. On their part, Black Power militants issued the first ever significant pro-Palestinian viewpoints ever to reach a large audience of Americans. Because stemming from their internationalist anti-imperialism, Black Power militants latched onto the Palestinian cause as a liberation struggle being waged by a kindred people of color that was eminently deserving of their support. They saw themselves and the Palestinians waging a revolution against a global system of oppression. Given that the Black Power movement in many ways threatened their vision of the multiracial beloved community of Christians and Jews united for justice, it comes as no surprise that on the other hand, mainstream civil rights advocates quickly countered by lining up fairly solidly behind Israel. That was a safer, more traditional, inside-the-system attitude that reflected their overall more conservative vision of black identity and more conservative vision of wider politics. Change the system, do not seek to overthrow it. And so that's why this whole issue became of such importance in intra-black discussions. It was not merely because they held different perspectives, but also because it became a crucially important reference point by which they created and articulated their respective visions of identity, place, and struggle. So today I'd like to explore this topic with you by first doing a little explaining about how I, as someone who has studied and written a lot about very technical issues of land and land ownership and property and compensation in the Middle East, came upon this very American history-oriented topic. And secondly, just to give you a flavor of some of the more significant groups and people at the time who were issuing statements on this question in the 60s and 70s. And finally, to note how contemporary Black American politics and culture are still intertwined with those of the Palestinians. So first, how did I get interested in this? Well, I do teach a course on the 60s in America at a liberal arts college in Central Virginia. And it was doing some research into a memoir by a member of the Weather Underground who mentioned that when the Weather Underground had broken Timothy Leary, the great LSD advocate, out of prison, that he went to Algeria and then flew to Beirut, quote, to meet the PLO. And I thought, well, now I've been decades involved in Middle Eastern history and all my life a participant and observer of American history, and I've never heard of this. Then I read that Malcolm X had visited Gaza. And one thing after another, and I suddenly realized there's this entire story of the interconnectedness of the black freedom struggle and the Arab-Israeli conflict, the 60s left in general, and the Arab-Israeli conflict that I don't find in histories of the 60s and I don't find in histories of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And one thing led to another, and here I stand before you. So let me first look at the Black Power wing of the black freedom struggle and start with another story. On September 4th, 1964, an Egyptian government car departed Cairo and headed east, crossing the Sinai Peninsula and continuing across the hot desert before finally arriving in the town of Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip. One of the passengers in the car was keenly aware of what it meant to be an exile like the Palestinian exiles living in Gaza, and that was Malcolm X, who passionately fought for the freedom of blacks in America who lived themselves hundreds of years and thousands of miles from their own ancestral homelands in Africa. Malcolm X had already been in Arab Palestine. One of the things I found in my book is that he had actually been in East Jerusalem very, very briefly in July 1959. But when he went to Gaza, he spent 2 days. He met with the Egyptian governor's assistant, a man named Mustafa Khafaga, if we're going to be Egyptian about it. He prayed in the main mosque with Munir Reyes, the mayor of Gaza. He visited Palestinian refugee camps. He issued a press conference and returned to Cairo and wrote a very stinging article in an English language paper called the Egyptian Gazette called Zionist Logic. He wrote this shortly after he met with the newly created PLO and its first leader, Ahmed Shaqiri. And in that article, Malcolm X wrote, quote, "Did the Zionists have the legal or moral right to invade Arab Palestine, uproot its Arab citizens from their homes, and seize all Arab property for themselves, just based on the religious claim that their forefathers lived there thousands of years ago? Only 1,000 years ago, the Moors lived in Spain. Would this give the Moors of today the legal and moral right to invade the Iberian Peninsula and drive out its Spanish citizens and set up a new Moroccan nation where Spain used to be, as the Zionists have done to our Arab brothers and sisters in Palestine?" After his assassination, Malcolm's own identity and connection with the Black freedom struggle and the Arab-Israeli conflict continued, in that a little-known follower of his named Ethel Miner ended up working for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And in August of 1967, shortly after the war, SNCC issued a newsletter article that roundly condemned Israel and hailed the Palestinian struggle. This came as a thunderclap to both black Americans and the wider liberal to left American public. Blacks were supporting the Palestinians. How dare they? Language was used about pro-Soviet dupes, anti-Semitism. The fact is that SNCC's article reflected a growing trend within the Black Power movement that later saw other SNCC activists such as Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, and James Foreman, all of whom supported the Palestinians to some degree publicly, to some degree privately. This brouhaha continued the next month in September 1967 when the National New Politics Conference in Chicago, black militants insisted that an anti-Israel plank be adopted, much to the horror of mainstream liberals and leftists, including Martin Peretz, who actually funded the conference, and it greatly annoyed him, and we know where that all ended up. The Black Panthers, particularly starting in 1969, also took up the mantle of Black Power pro-Palestinianism in a quite visceral way. Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, D.C. Cox, Eldridge Cleaver, David Hilliard, all well-known figures in the Black Panther Party, all supported quite ardently the Palestinians. D.C. Cox once said in March 1970, for example, quote, "The Palestinian liberation struggle stands in the vanguard of the struggle against the Zionist menace that plagues the people of the entire Arab world in general and has usurped the national rights and freedom of the Palestinian people in particular. The Black Panther Party unconditionally and firmly supports the just struggle of the Palestinian people and their war of national salvation against the lackey state of Israel and its imperialist backers." Quite a statement. Eldridge Cleaver, in a statement that probably was written by his wife, Kathleen, but nonetheless said something similar. Quote, "The struggle of the Palestinian people for their freedom and liberation from U.S. imperialism and its lackeys is also our struggle. We recognize that if the Palestinian people cannot get their freedom and liberation, neither can we." Intimately connecting the two struggles. The Black Arts Movement, names such as Amiri Baraka, Don Lee, who now goes by Hakim Adhabuti, Harold Cruz, Hoyt Fuller, all wrote of their support for Palestinians in their prose and in their poetry. Even outside the Black Arts Movement, men and women of letters such as James Baldwin and Shirley Graham Du Bois also hailed the Palestinian cause. And in 1970, a black-owned press here in Washington called Drum and Spear Press, published a book co-edited by Edmund Gharib, who I just saw out there somewhere, entitled Enemy of the Sun, Poetry of Palestinian Resistance, that contained poems from noted Palestinian poets such as Samih al-Qasim and Tawfiq Zayed. For their part, however, more conservative civil rights leaders, the other side of the black freedom struggle, had a quite different stance. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, for example, was quick to condemn SNCC for its newsletter article, issuing a public statement even though he himself had not yet read the article. He not only faulted SNCC, but suggested that it was becoming both un-American and anti-Semitic. Quote, if the text is as reported, as I said, he didn't read it, SNCC is openly following the Soviet line in the Arab-Israeli matter. In addition, by its reported attacks upon Jews, it is following the age-old hate line. It is a sad development that young Negroes seeking to overcome the injustices suffered by their race should employ against the Jews the same hateful distortions and lies that have been used for 350 years against their own kind. Similar such roundly pro-Israeli statements came from the likes of James Farmer of CORE, Roy Innes of CORE. Interestingly, Wilfred Ussery, who was the national chairman of CORE, briefly pushed the group in a pro-Israeli direction. The National Urban League and Whitney Young, sometimes derided by Black Power advocates as Whitey Young, offered one of the most stinging rebukes of SNCC in the summer of '67, remarking that the newsletter resembled the Nazi Party's attitudes toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yet of all the conservative civil rights leaders who most championed Israel, by far and away the most fervent and active supporter of Israel was Bayard Rustin. And let me talk about him with another story. It had seemed like a good idea to Bayard Rustin at the time. By mid-1970, the 58-year-old socialist, pacifist, labor advocate, and civil rights activist had participated in some of the most famous campaigns and events of the civil rights era, including being the one who planned the March on Washington in 1963. But he was also a passionate supporter of Israel, called by some, quote, Israel's man in Harlem. He thought that placing a strongly pro-Israeli advertisement in the New York Times and the Washington Post, signed by dozens of prominent Black Americans, would go far in counteracting hostile Black Power attitudes toward Israel, and in the process would help frayed Black-Jewish relations heal themselves by showing the Jews that not all Blacks supported the Arabs. He added at the final end, despite his pacifist background, a statement urging President Nixon to supply state-of-the-art military aircraft to Israel. The ad engendered a host of responses. American Jewish groups were thrilled. Others, notably Black groups, expressed visceral hostility. Some Black Power advocates were livid for what they considered Rustin's Uncle Tom groveling to gain the approval of Jews, and at least two of the signatories, including a member of Congress, complained the text was not what they had agreed to sign. He weathered the criticism, but later in life admitted that perhaps the sentence about the sale of weapons to Israel had been a mistake. Why was Rustin so passionate, so insistent on demonstrating the bona fides of Black Americans as good, loyal supporters of Israel? Some of it, people who knew him said, stemmed from his own identification with Jews as fellow sufferers. Others, though, clearly stemmed from his own political transformations. The man who famously in 1965 said that Blacks need to move from protests to politics, work within the system, with the labor unions, with the Democratic Party, with progressive Jewish Americans. And clearly this safe and sane reformist attitude, I think, is in particular what guided his attitudes toward Israel and his, because he was viscerally anti-Black Power to begin with, let alone their statements about Israel. I might add that in response to that newspaper article, that December, a group of Black Americans calling themselves the Committee of Black Americans for Truth in the Middle East put a strongly negative, hostile ad against Rustin and against Israel in the New York Times. So we had the dueling op-ed, or the doing ads in the New York Times. That second ad managed to get 56 people to sign it, including famous Black Power figures like Robert F. Williams, Ella Collins, Malcolm X's half-sister, Albert Clegg, the minister from Detroit, poets like A.B. Spellman and Earl O'Farrill, and a host of others, including Black feminists like Frances M. Beale and Maxine Williams. And then we had in the middle Martin Luther King Jr. Typically, the storyline one hears today is that King was solidly behind Israel. It's actually a bit more nuanced, and let me start with a story. It was after midnight on a summer night in 1967, and a dejected Martin Luther King Jr. was on the telephone speaking frankly about his depressed feelings. It was July 24th, and he'd begun a lengthy telephone call with several of his aides. At the end of the conversation, one of King's advisors, Harry Wachtel, tried to encourage the dejected civil rights leader by telling him, "Martin, do not despair, you are on the right track." King responded gloomily, "There were dark days before, but this is the darkest." What did he mean? He had lived through many difficult times. What were he and his associates talking about that made him so depressed that he called that July evening the darkest of his life? The subject was the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly how the war that had broken out the previous month might negatively affect a public pilgrimage to the region that he had been planning for over a year. The Arab-Israeli conflict indeed was a headache that King didn't need. King himself was no stranger to the Palestinian suffering. He had been to Jerusalem and the West Bank in March of 1959. In fact, while he was there, he became ill and was treated by an Armenian doctor born and bred in Jerusalem, who's still around, named Viken Kalbian of Anira fame. And Kalbian told me that he was called quickly, Martin Luther King is here, go to his hotel. He had not yet received the Nobel Peace Prize, but he was a well-known figure nonetheless. And Dr. Kalbian went to the YMCA hostel there in East Jerusalem, and King and his wife were there, and he treated them, and he said, as I got up to leave, King said, "Please sit down. We'd like to hear the Arab side of this story." Now, Dr. Kalbian, while ethnically Armenian, had grown up. He's fluent in Arabic. He was essentially a member of the Palestinian community. He personally had been a refugee from 1948, leaving a very nice home in West Jerusalem. And firsthand from a refugee, King and his wife were told the story of the Palestinians. Dr. Kalbian told me he later arranged for a dinner, for a lunch, that is to say, where King could and did have lunch with eminent Palestinians such as Anwar Nusseibeh and Ruhi al-Khatib. So King was no stranger to the Palestinians and the injustices that they had suffered. And yet in the summer of '67, the SNCC newsletter, the New Politics Convention in Chicago, prompted him to issue a statement on behalf of his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, entitled Anti-Semitism, Israel, and SCLC, a statement on press distortions. King very carefully, for the remainder of his short life, balanced his public assertion of Israel's right to exist. He was always very clear about that, but whenever asked, he always linked it with about as strong a statement as he was willing to make on the Palestinians, which was Israel has a right to exist, but the Arab world is mired in poverty and needs development if Arab feelings are ever going to subside about Israel. It's hardly a strongly pro-Palestinian statement, but King clearly, from his own personal experience there, knew enough about what was animating Arab anger at Israel that whenever he spoke on Israel and its right to exist, and he was clear about that, he always linked it to forward movement on issues relating to the Palestinians. Despite that fact, many people in today's world still like to get political capital out of Martin Luther King. This was recently exposed about 15 years ago when a letter called Letter to a Zionist Friend that King allegedly wrote and that appears in a book was a hoax. And even the authors of the book have since had to concede that this letter did not exist in reality. So the idea of trying to milk King for pro-Israeli legitimacy is still with us today. By the 1970s, I'll hurry it along to say that Support for Palestinians, the ability to criticize, even if mildly, Israeli actions was spilling over from the Black Power movement even into mainstream black politics. Shirley Chisholm, in running for Congress, the first black person to run on a major party nomination for president in 1972. One of her, in fact, it was her second ever press conference, said, quote, "A generation has grown up in the Palestinian ghetto, and like the young who have survived their early years in our ghettos, these Palestinians have made clear they will no longer tolerate the injustice of their condition. Their acts of desperation in recent years have shocked us, perhaps unnecessarily, for we should have learned from our problems here at home, the inevitable result of social injustice and poverty." People running for president today don't usually talk about the Palestinians that way. The National Black Political Conference, even the brouhaha over Andrew Young's firing by President Carter as the United States ambassador to the United Nations in 1979, triggered a very hostile response from mainstream black leaders, several of whom, including Joseph Lowery, Walter Fauntroy, and Jesse Jackson, went on in the late summer of 1979 to visit the Middle East and express their support for not just the Palestinians, but for peace in the region. In other words, by the 1970s, radicals and conservatives alike were addressing the Arab-Israeli conflict, and quite typically in ways that stressed the need for justice for the Palestinians. And it even extended into the level of culture. The boxer Muhammad Ali traveled to Beirut and to refugee camps in southern Lebanon, Mia Omia and Al Ain al-Halwa in 1974. Taking time away from his boxing, he declared, quote, "In my name and the name of all Muslims in America, I declare support for the Palestinian struggle to liberate their homeland and oust the Zionist invaders." And then we come to today to close my comments. In looking at how the Black Power wing of the Black freedom struggle and the more conservative civil rights wing collectively were wrestling with issues of their own identity and political action at home, and how that animated their stances toward the Middle East, it's important to pause to consider how much the conversation about liberation, the identity, particularly with the Palestinians, has continued to grow, even into the black mainstream until today. And I'll start my last little 2 or 3 minutes with my final story. Black university student Christian Davis Bailey was shocked to discover, when he visited the West Bank in the summer of 2013, that Palestinians there had painted a tribute to Trayvon Martin, the black American youth shot and killed in Sanford, Florida in February 2012 under controversial circumstances, had painted a tribute to him on the large separation wall built in the West Bank by Israeli occupation forces. Then in August 2014, Palestinians issued a statement of solidarity with the family of Michael Brown, a young black man shot and killed by a white police officer that month in Ferguson, Missouri. When black insurrections broke out in Ferguson, other Palestinians began sending tweets to the protesters that were confronting the police in Ferguson, advising them on strategies on how to combat the effects of police tear gas and other practical lessons that they themselves had learned from years of clashes with the Israeli army. Like some of the black protesters in America that were doing, these Palestinians were noticing the parallels between their experiences with security forces and that of faraway African Americans. One young man in the West Bank village of Bil'in even sent a photo showing himself holding a sign reading, "The Palestinian people know what it means to be shot while unarmed because of your ethnicity." In turn, Palestinian students visited Ferguson a few months later in November of 2014 and returned to the West Bank to organize events explaining the struggle of black Americans to their fellow Palestinians. For their part, a delegation of American activists associated with groups like Black Lives Matter and the Dream Defenders visited the West Bank in the first months of 2015. And Christian Davis Bailey then joined with another young black activist named Khoury Peterson Smith and drafted a statement in November of 2015 entitled The 2015 Black Solidarity Statement with Palestine, that was signed by over 1,000 noted African American activists, scholars, and others, including such luminaries as Angela Davis, Cornel West, and Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors. The foundation of the Israeli state came through the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, noted young Peterson Smith. And while there are differences between Israel and the U.S., we can see parallels with a country that was founded on the enslavement of black people and where anti-black racism remains at the heart of U.S. society centuries later. His co-writer concurred and directly referenced the example set by the Black freedom struggle when he said, quote, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Black Panther Party taught us that internationalism is a central part of our liberation here. This statement seeks to honor the legacy of Black internationalism and the historic solidarity between Black and Palestinian struggles as our movements enter a new chapter. And I might add that it is not just the political level, but a number of Black rap and hip-hop artists, Jassery X, Boots Riley, Talib Kweli, Mos Def, have also referenced the Palestinians in their struggles. In conclusion, then, all of these 21st century examples of African Americans expressing support for Palestinians and linking their own identity and political programs on a global anti-imperialist discourse of liberation illustrates the lasting power of the notion first articulated back in the 60s, that for blacks, Palestine was a kindred country of color, struggling to be free from occupation, as they were. This conceptualization, by the way, implies that if African Americans and Palestinians are of color, then their oppressors, conversely, are white, which begs the question, is Israel white? Menachem Shalev, a press officer at the Israeli consulate in New York, once told an American journalist in 1986 that when dealing with the American journalists, he always stressed that, quote, we are just like you, an essentially white European people. And more recently, complaining about the influx of African Muslim migrants into Israel, Interior Minister Eli Yishai stated in 2012 that, quote, Muslims that arrive here do not even believe that this country belongs to us, the white man, which is actually interesting considering Yishai is a Jew of Tunisian background. As I've outlined tonight, the Arab-Israeli conflict, or today, we're still in the day, the Arab-Israeli conflict was intimately connected with how the Black freedom struggle played itself out in America in the 60s and 70s. Inasmuch as Black groups' stances toward that conflict reflected and deepened their own respective attitudes about race, politics, allies, identity, and foreign policy. Indeed, the first time most Americans ever heard about the Palestinian struggle came because of Black activists like those in the Black Power movement. In the short term, the Palestinian problem therefore achieved greater visibility within the wider American body politic. In the longer term, African Americans' embrace of the Palestinian discourse of national liberation has led to permanent changes in American culture. And the fact that the Palestinian problem has remained on America's political radar screen in the 50 years since it was first placed there by Black Power activists in the 60s stands as a testament to the staying power of this phenomenon. Palestine solidarity is indeed still alive among peoples of color in America today, who identify viscerally with the Palestinian struggle. Palestine remains for them, as first expressed in the 1960s, a kindred country of color. Thanks very much for listening.
Dr. Fischbach, thank you very much for that presentation. We really appreciate it. So we're going to take some questions now. Again, please keep your questions brief and to the point so everyone can have a chance.
Thank you. Thanks very much for a fascinating presentation. I have two questions. The first is when you were discussing mainstream civil rights leaders talking about the Palestinians, the examples you gave tended to frame their views about Palestinian justice in terms of economic injustice rather than political rights. And I was wondering if the examples you gave are typical also of others that you saw during your research. And the second question concerns Jesse Jackson, who was, I think, also very much a mainstream civil rights leader rather than a Black Power activist, but appears to have shifted substantially from, let's say, one camp to the other. And I was curious if that trajectory was also typical of many of his colleagues, or whether he was an outlier in your view.
Good questions. King, at least among the documents I've seen in public statements, was the only one who I saw, well, Bayard Rustin did somewhat, that at all tried to understand Palestinian grievances as stemming from something other than just abject anti-Semitism. But because King was so associated with the poor, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the Poor People's March, I think that came. I think number one, it came natural to him to stress economic justice because he was seeing inner city areas like here in Washington, as a result of his death, going up in smoke, and very much trying to understand violence and intemperance as stemming from economic issues. But he was also smart enough to know that it came from profoundly political places. And I think in his case, that was as far as he was willing to go, to recognize a political nature to Palestinian grievances. I think was just a red line he wouldn't cross. So on the one hand, it came as natural to him to stress poverty and healing poverty, and that will solve violence. But Jesse Jackson himself wrote later on, he said, Martin told me once privately that the Palestinian issue is going to be the next, quote, big thing in the world. So King knew it wasn't going to go away just by throwing economic development money at them. As far as Jackson, he's a complicated fellow, and he shifted a lot, as did his hairstyles and styles of dress. He had considerable political ambitions, but he did, particularly in the 80s, link up with Arab American activists, certainly in groups like ADC and trying to get the Democratic Party to adopt programs, national platforms that included statements about Palestine. I would say from my research, he's probably one of the few that did things like that. There were people who flipped sides. Wyatt T. Walker, for instance, is a minister who later became strongly pro-Palestinian, but he wasn't out there in the political world trying to do something about it in the way Jackson did. But I think there needs to be more work done on Jackson, and particularly his connection with Arab Americans. But it's a good question.
Michael, sorry, I got the mic.
I wasn't looking back.
I remember actually when I was in Beirut in the late 70s when Jesse Jackson and Joseph Lowery and people came to visit, and one of the things that was like scariest for them was the driving of the PLO drivers. It was scary for a lot of us. But
Get the guns and worry about the driving.
yeah, white knuckling it. So what can you say about the this sort of plays onto the so-called whiteness of the Israeli elite, but about the Zionism is racism resolution and how that played into the whole thing, and then obviously the Israelis' subsequent hurried attempt to import lots of Jews of color from Ethiopia to show that Zionism wasn't just a white thing.
Taking the second part of that first, a lot of that was coming, particularly the Ethiopians, was coming after the period I was studying. But I do know that Bayard Rustin was an old-line socialist. He was a member of the Socialist Party of America. It later split. He became the head of something called Social Democrats USA, which is sort of the nucleus of the neoconservative movement. So he always claimed he was still a socialist and was big pals with the Israeli Labor Party. And even a pro-Israel acolyte like him was really taken aback by the Likud election victory in 1977. I mean, Begin presented him a lot of pro-Israeli people, certainly a lot of American Jews, with a real problem. How can you be pro-Israel when you've got such an obtuse kind of set of policies coming out? And Rustin himself actually went to Israel to speak on behalf, particularly of a group of Americans called the Black Hebrews in Dimona, who weren't being allowed much of anything, and spoke on their behalf. I mean, Rustin did try to speak, I don't know specifically about Ethiopians, but, you know, sort of Jews of color. And of course, more than half of Israelis are of Middle Eastern and North African descent, more broadly. Yes, they were Americans that said that they were Jews and thus were seeking citizenship under the right of return.
But their conversions were not recognized.
Correct. So there was some interest in this issue of Jews of color. And I'm sorry, the first part of your question was?
About the Zionism as racism revolution.
It was part of the story in the sense that racial oppression, particularly the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, was very much on the world screen in the mid-'70s. And that resolution was actually written by a guy named Fayez Sayer. And the great speech that Daniel Patrick Moynihan gave, where he, you know, rails against it, part of that speech was actually written by Norman Podhoretz, who's a neocon, strongly supportive person of Israel who's still around. So the politics of the Arab-Israeli thing were very much intertwined in all of that. Because, you know, liberation struggles were still going on in places like Angola and Mozambique. And the women's conferences in 1975 had spoken of this, and it was very much on the world screen. And that's one reason I think it terrified supporters of Israel, is because it was linking, not just Black Power advocates in the United States, but now the halls of wisdom in the UN were echoing the same thing, that this is just another form of it, of racial discrimination. Yes, ma'am.
This is great, because my question actually was going to be more squarely in the African context of the conversation.
Right.
Because also during that time, there were all kinds of challenges around independence and then collaboration and support for these independent movements across the continent. And a lot of that support came from Arab leaders in North Africa versus outside, because of, the whole history of that story. So I'm just curious to know, as you were doing your research, whether or not that identity with African struggles also came into play around some of the Black American leaders and the relationship across the board. You commented about the anti-apartheid movement, but you could pick country by country by country and look at where support in liberation and independence and, structural adjustment came from, and it was typically from Arab leaders and not anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, because during that time, many of us were learning, right, about what was going on in the geopolitical context of race, black and white, and ethnicity politics. So just curious to know.
It's a great question, because it absolutely was true. Many Black Power militants, in particular young Black Power militants, but others, really cut their teeth on global anti-imperialist politics, reading, for instance, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, in which Fanon talks about, quote, Negroes and Arabs together, of creating a culture of what he called negritude, of blackness. And the fact that many of these people, and including King, had been to places like Ghana, people had been to Algeria, Eldridge Cleaver and his wife and some other Panthers were in Algeria, SNCC activists, they very much saw it. And the fact that Palestinians spoke, the liberation group Fatah issued a pamphlet in 1969 for a Pan-African festival in Algeria, in which they said, we are Palestinians, we are part of Africa, the idea, if we're not literally part of Africa, the continent. And the fact that, and another thing that some of them told me was that the Palestinians spoke English, and a lot of other people in Algeria spoke French, so they could actually relate to these people, relate to the Zimbabweans and the South and people like the African National Congress, because they actually spoke English. But both ideologically and practical terms, I think the idea that Africans were visibly peoples of color, that many were Muslims, like Black Americans were embracing Islam, and the fact that they were waging a clear struggle that was boiling down for all the anti-imperialist policies, really boiling down to a question of colonizers who were white and colonized who are not, I think gave a sense of identity that was much tighter than, let's say, embracing Asian struggles, let's say the Vietnamese, even though politically, of course, they were, this felt more at home. So I think that's a very apt point and very much true. Particularly the North African Arab struggles and the subcontinental Arabs, but it extends into the Middle East too. Stokely Carmichael was shown around Syria in August and September of 1967, and he was being given a tour by a woman named Randa Khalidi al-Fattal, who is she's the daughter of a very well-known Lebanese feminist named Anbar Salam, and she's the daughter of a famous Palestinian educator named Ahmed Sameh al-Khalidi. And she's very fair, blonde, and she was showing Stokely Carmichael around Syria. And she told me that he stopped her and said, "Sister Randa, you don't know it, but you're blacker than I am." This idea that, you know, the Arabs, black Americans were part of one struggle here. Go ahead.
Actually, I was just going to ask the same question, but I was going to add Nasser into it. Yeah, I was going to ask the same question and, you know, talk about Fanoun and Algeria, but also Cairo, you know, was really an important center, right, for African liberation movement.
It was. In fact, I referenced Shirley Graham Du Bois when the coup ousted Nkrumah from Ghana in 1966, where she had been living with other American blacks. She actually moved with her son David to Cairo. And when she was writing some of her more stridently pro-Arab poetry and prose, she was living in the Duqi section of Cairo, or Duqi, if we're going to be Egyptian about it, section of Cairo, where the PLO actually had its headquarters. And of course, Malcolm X had gone there for the Africa summit in '64. So yes, you're absolutely right. Being a city of culture, Cairo was very much a magnet. Maya Angelou was in Ghana, right, as a young woman. Right. Good question. Here and then back here.
Okay. So your talk today is very timely because of what we've seen happening with Marc Lamont Hill, of course. But the larger implications for that is this is what happens to anyone and many unknown scholars, writers who speak out against Israel. How can we, as both African Americans, but larger American society, how can we really combat this? And I know you might not have the entire answer, but historically, what you studied is the solidarity. How can we bring that solidarity to bear to really change or shift this paradigm where anything said about Israel is automatically seen as anti-Semitic, automatically seen as some sort of violent rant against the Israeli people?
He was, I think the technical word was a consultant, or anyway, CNN, you know, the supposedly liberal, the liberal side of Fox. He appeared, and he was at a conference in which he said a number of things, including, you know, justice for Palestinians from the river to the sea, which again, to say you want justice for Palestinians is not to say you want injustice for Israelis, but putting that aside, then, so CNN voided his contract, so he's no longer there. And he's black. So there was this, you know, like so much going on in the last 2 years, there's a lot of racialized politics going on. I would say the following. Number one, I'm not sure what to do. But number two, if I were giving advice, particularly to the Democratic Party, okay, now, I won't say, never mind. If I were giving advice to the Democratic Party, I would say the following. Just this morning in the Israeli press, there were two articles I noticed. One of them is that, is it Rashida Tlaib? I think it's the Rashida. has already announced she's going on a West Bank tour and encouraging others to go. And the other article in the English Haaretz website said that Nancy Pelosi was speaking, I think it was yesterday, at some congressional event in which both Chaim Saban, big funder for the Democrats, and Sheldon Adelson, big funder for the Republicans, were together in it's some kind of Congress for Israel group or something, and she was assuring them both not to listen to some of these wayward voices coming out of the Democratic Party, that the Democratic, and Chuck Schumer was beaming next to her, that, we're still solidly behind you. If I were giving advice to the likes of Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York, and even someone from Central Virginia who threw out Congressman Dave Brad, who's a former colleague of mine at Randolph-Macon College, I would say, speak to your base. I mean, everybody, the other side's speaking to its base. And your base is talking about justice, it's talking about health care, it's talking about a new generation, it's talking about people of color, it's talking about women. And I would say, personally, don't tone down your argument. Go for your base. Because whether it's the alignment policies of the Communist Party going back to the 30s, or the socialists, or the Democratic Party, this idea of, well, we'll infiltrate and we'll move the unions, we'll move the Democrats leftward, I would argue that never works. Never has worked. When people say that's the only game in town, I'd say, well, then the game is rigged. I'm not saying third parties are the answer, but hoping that you're going to pull this leftward isn't going to work. So I would argue the way to get that kind of change you're talking about is just to focus on the grassroots. Tip O'Neill, famous Speaker of the House, once said, all politics is local. Speak to what your constituents want, and they get this discourse. I mean, outside of about 5 million Israeli Jews and a number of Americans, virtually the other 6 billion humans on Earth understand this situation in the same way. Okay, people who talk like that are not outliers. And to remain true to that, and as opposed to hoping to change the leadership. So that's a way of not answering your question under the guise of offering advice to young activists in the Democratic Party, notably women and notably people of color, who get the issue. Who get the issue. They see it in their own lives. And I'm not even getting into things like cooperation between Israeli security firms and American police and so on and so forth. Yes, you've been having your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if in the course of your research, you discovered how involved the Israeli Mossad and other Israeli security forces were in fighting against anti-colonial forces in Africa.
Yes, and more importantly, there were black activists in the 60s and 70s who were making those connections. The issue of African liberation. In 1970, there was a minor brouhaha in an organization based here in D.C. called the American Committee on Africa, because one of its members, a fellow named William Hightower, had issued this very strong public rebuke of Bayard Rustin after that newspaper piece he published. And other people, higher-ups, including Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and others, began complaining to the American Committee on Africa, which was basically a white-led liberal group advocating for justice in South Africa, that you need to rein this fellow in. The black staff of the American Committee on Africa rallied around Hightower, as did a white professor whom I also knew from my days at Georgetown, Richard Stevens. And it created this real stark divide because people, the younger staff, were saying, look, Israel is in bed with South Africa, 110%. We won't even get into other things like Nigeria. How can we say we stand for liberation of South Africa and not take a stand on the Arab-Israeli conflict? So, yeah, there were very much people at the time, again, notably black activists, who very much understood. The SNCC's newsletter article in the summer of '67, that's one of the things it said. These guys are in bed with the South Africans. And we as people of color suffering in South Africa, we have to call this out. So yes, very much they were aware of it.
What about Angola and Mozambique? What did you discover about Israeli involvement there?
In my research, I didn't get into that, which is not to say I'm not aware, but as far as its spillover into what Black Americans were talking about, notably in the 70s, I saw very little about that particular issue. I saw a lot about South Africa, though. Yes, sir.
Your focus has been on the African American or Black Power movement here, and it's trying to come to terms with the anti-imperialist arguments. The American Jewish community has similarly been divided on this very issue, and it's not clear to me how we're going to transcend it without really confronting alternatives to imperialism. And I hope that the new progressive Democrats in Congress are willing to follow that logic in foreign policy. Rashid Tlaib may be ready to do that, and this trip to Palestine will expose more clearly this connection that I think you're very appropriately pointing to, but I'm not sure that even if the African American community figures out how to address these issues, we're going to make more clear the underlying contradiction between capitalism and capitalism and its imperialist base and social justice. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think these last couple of questions about how Israel has weathered, in a sense, the criticism is as relevant as how to expose the larger conflict of imperialism, that Israel is clearly in bed with the U.S. on. How do we begin to make progress on that larger question?
Let me say two things really quickly. The first is that this research project was part of a much larger research project. It took me about 10 years, which was investigating the broader left in America in the 60s and 70s. And I have another book probably coming out in about a year and a half or 2 years on how the white left in turn became quite divided over what to do in the 60s and 70s. And given the disproportionately strong Jewish presence in the American left, historically and in the 60s, you ended up having some of the most vociferous critics of Israel in SDS, in the Yippies, in the Communist Party, in the Socialist Workers' Party being Jews, and some of the most strong liberal left people in the Communist Party, in the Socialists, backing Israel were also Jews. So on that particular question, stay tuned for my next book. As far as the wider question you're raising, I think, and again, if you're talking about real change in America, one has to look beyond the Democratic Party, personally. Now, heads and tails on a coin are two very different things, but it's the same coin. And if you want to operate with an entirely different currency, then a head side or a tail side isn't doing you any good. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and indeed the wider American public, takes the capitalist nature of America for granted, takes for granted that politics is ultimately decided through voting in Congress, despite the civil rights movement and other things showing the power of people politics in the streets. And number three, as an educator myself, I don't think American children are taught that most Americans do not fundamentally make a connection with the fact that our liberal democracy was part of a colonial settler experience that dispossessed entire nations. And so to me, the commonality between the Palestinian experience, the idea that largely Europeans feel or felt in the age of imperialism that they had a right to move to other parts of the world without visas, without ICE and immigration and all that, and just set up camp and say, well, we're not just coming here as tourists, we're actually going to make our own country here. I don't think Americans either get fundamentally that that's at the heart of the struggle between Zionism and the Arabs of Palestine, nor do they fully appreciate that that's what our experience has been. I think sympathy for what the American Indians went through is much greater than when I was a child, for instance. But actually following that to its logical conclusion and saying we are because they are not, and thus so that's step one, and then making the connection to things going on in other parts of the world, including the Middle East, it takes a lot of work, frankly. And I think that's going to have to go much deeper than, for instance, people in the Democratic Party. The conventional political process at heart has to really do a level of self-examination. Our country can't seem to have an honest conversation about race, why Africans are brought here in the first place, let alone contextualize the wrenching of those people out of Africa with the wrenching out of America of the Indians themselves. So I don't want to sound pessimistic, but that's a very deep process, I think, for Americans to make the connections with colonialism, with the nature of capitalism, with expansion of European economic systems and actual European peoples to other parts of the world, and draw the logical conclusion that about liberation, I think, is a long road ahead of us. I think I'll leave it at that.
Dr. Fisher, I have one final, I think we have time for one final question,
Yes.
which I'm going to take.
You're the boss.
You might know, I'm sure you know Bakari Sellers, who's a frequent commentator on CNN. And if I'm not mistaken, I think his dad was a leader in SNCC, if I'm not mistaken. And so he's taken this position. He's like the AIPAC kind of, the token guy for AIPAC. So, his dad had a much different view, you could say. So would you say it's just a purely, political move for him to, embrace them? Or do you think he's ideologically actually agrees with that, with the pro-Israel side?
I think you're referencing Cleveland Sellers.
I think Cleveland is his dad.
Yes, his father.
Yeah.
I don't know him or how he got to his politics. I do know that the 60s led to all sorts of flipping and flopping. People associated with Merritt may recall that, although he's now dead, this fiercely pro-Israeli fellow named Barry Rubin used to be part of Merritt, that David Horowitz was associated with the Black Panthers. And to be fair, people like people who I think have spoken here, such as the writer M.J. Rosenberg, have gone the other way, from being having these stridently pro-Israeli student groups in the 60s to now seeing a lot of sympathy for Palestinians. So I don't know in his case, but I do know that as in the case of King in the 60s, as in the case of the NAACP, when people have chosen, other people certainly have chosen a more safe and sane approach because of the visceral kinds of hostility one attracts. And that's one of the ultimate interesting facts about everything that I've been studying, is that today, 50 years later, it is much easier for someone to speak about Palestinian rights. At the same time, the pro-Israeli backlash and forces of intimidation are also much stronger than they were in the 50 years ago.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you so much for a great presentation. Everybody, please remember, right there in the corner, we'll have the books for sale, so please get a copy if you can. Thank you.